Good evening, everyone. My name is Paul Young. I'm going to do a brief presentation on First Nations funding. It's a big issue that's come up, not so much as a huge issue for voters because it really only impacts First Nation people across Canada. But I want to highlight the multiple issues that you're dealing with First Nations across the country and the pandering that's going on right now. When we deal with the Conservative government of Canada, they basically have funded First Nations each year as part of the Aboriginal Affairs Department. What you're hearing from the opposition parties is a bunch of pandering for First Nations votes, whether it's with education or economic opportunities. So what I'm going to do is highlight certain aspects of First Nations. One thing I like to say to the First Nations are critical people to this country, and I appreciate all the work they've done over the years. And I also understand a lot of what they go through in terms of especially the remote reserves compared to ones that are more connected by highway systems and stuff like that. So there are a lot of pressures when you're living on a First Nation reserves that we don't necessarily would see directly. So I'm not trying to push sides and all that. I'm just looking at the most effective policies and to make sure that whatever goes to them, that the information is conveyed correctly. So how this all started with me, many months ago, I got into a debate, and it's sad tragedy happened in Saskatchewan when there was a fire on a reserve that two young children lost their lives. So I was very active in the response, and this is a post from Nikki Ashton, who basically called me out for my comments in terms of really quantifying the issues with that particular reserve. And now I don't want to put the underlying the sadness, but I really had a hard time that the NDP using the tragedy to push their own political agenda. And that's what Nikki Ashton is doing with this comment, basically trying to give me a history lesson when she, realistically, all I was looking for is why is one band that sets priority differently in terms of compensating their band members in terms of close to, I believe when I did the analysis, of about $600,000 as compared to another band that I looked at in Ontario that's got similar structure. They're connected to roads and they've got similar structures in terms of support from firefighting that they could leverage from a township. And yet the one in Ontario which I used was Chikeen First Nation, which is on Manitoulin Island, seems to get it right in setting the priorities. The Saskatchewan that this individual, Nikki Ashton, came out did not. They had a fire truck that was sitting in the bush that wasn't even operational. So they decided that, you know what, instead of paying or putting money towards our fire station, they decided that it was more important to pay their band members more money. And that's my biggest concern with this. It's not all First Nations. It comes back to the band council setting the right priorities, but you're never going to get that message when you see something like that from Nikki Ashton. This is basically shows you now the request for plans and priorities. Every government agency has to set an RPP. This one shows you all the money being allocated to issues like education. It shows you social development. So this is all the money for all the bands it's going to as part of the funding that the government provides on an ongoing basis to First Nations. What the government of Canada wants is they want accountability and transparency on how that money is being spent. This is where you're getting pushed back by First Nations because the band councils themselves do not want to disclose salaries. They don't want to disclose how money is being spent. As a First Nation person, I would think you'd want to be concerned about how that money is being spent, especially if you're living in squalor and your chief and its band members are driving around in BMWs and living on the hog. That's very concerning to anybody that wants to see that, both myself as a taxpayer and First Nations people. And that's the reason why I'm just showing you that graph. This basically graph shows you that spending has been increased by the government, and Harper took office in 2006, so you're seeing that he still continually funds Aboriginal money each year. This shows you the amount of money spent on housing as well, and it basically talks about the number of people living on reserves. This talks about to you about the money that's spent by healthcare. The commitment the government is, it went up a bit in its flatline, but he's still funding it. That's what I want you to get out of that one. And let's talk about now. A lot of things has changed with First Nations, there's more economic opportunities on certain reserves as they're close to resource development, whether it's oil and gas, whether it's minerals. Now the key aspect of this is how do we basically formulate the right deals to help benefit the overall legacy of the First Nation reserves. In other words, we can mine the product out of the ground, but how do we ensure that there's a long-term benefit to the First Nations people? The money gets back into the community and all that. So I'm all for economic development, but you're never going to hear those conversations from the NDP. They have not yet once mentioned how they would handle economic activity. That's a concern to me, because that should be something that should be partnerships between all levels of government, including the provinces as well as the First Nations people, because they're the ones that have to reap the benefits. The other thing is, most First Nations, I believe all of them, have to have audited financial statements, and that's something that should be available to people. What is more required now is we want more transparency around the information to make sure that there's more disclosure around salaries or effectiveness of outcomes, whether it's education or healthcare. Now, this has been an ongoing thing. Mulcairga likes to spin this, and it is a sad tragedy of missing Aboriginals. But having another inquiry, I'm not sure is cost effective, considering that we know, based on the RCMP report, that the most of the Aboriginal missing women can be tied back to their reserves themselves, to Aboriginals, whether it's band council or people on the reserve. Now, what we need to do as a country is how do we better support these people in terms of social programs and social policy, right? That's not what Mulcair is talking about, right? Mulcair is talking about opening up wounds again, which I don't believe is the right approach to do it. I've just put on basically policing reserves. Some of these initiatives likely have happened or could be expanded by either a band council police or the RCMP. It just looks at different ways to kind of mentor people and help at-risk people. I brought up education now because it's a critical area. This is stuff that's not really disclosed properly either by Justin Trudeau or Thomas Mulcair. But prior to when Perry Bellegarde took over for the Assembly of First Nation, there was another chief named Sean Atteo. And basically he met with Harper and they hashed out an educational agreement. The issue why that got defeated was the First Nation council members, Assembly of First Nations, felt Sean Atteo was basically getting too close to Harper, and they didn't want that. They wanted more of an adversary relationship. So Atteo was pushed out and Bellegarde came in. And this is where you're seeing the fighting over education. There was money planned, and the government was planning to do it, as well as I believe right now, gives them more control over education. But you're never going to hear those statements from Mulcair. Why? Because he can't win on those policies. That's really in a nutshell is First Nations. Now, there's a lot of issues facing with them as water too. And we need to kind of look at technology like mobile sites like membrane systems and all that to support it. We need to, in a roundabout way, modernize the Indian Act to look at different options. The problem is that when you're dealing with First Nations, you're dealing with politics just like you would deal with any other organization. But the issues you're dealing with is you've got rich bands not willing to share with the poor brand. And that's something that needs to change as well. You also need to have more accountability and governance enforced by the Assembly of First Nation on audits to hold these chiefs and the councils accountable for their outcomes. And basically, how are they helping people? This idea of basically saying Harper's all at fault. You could throw money at the First Nations all you want, but that's not going to solve the problem unless you go to get the band councils to be held accountable.